Judge laughs at homeless grandmother in court, but has no idea who's about to walk in. You think sleeping in doorways makes you special, old woman? Judge Marcus Thornfield's voice boomed across the courtroom, his face twisted with disgust as he glared down at the frail figure before him. I've heard every sob story in the book, and yours isn't even original? If this story of justice and redemption moves you, please like and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in humanity. The gavel slammed down like thunder, making 74-year-old Margaret Chen flinch in her worn coat. Her arthritic hands trembled as she clutched a plastic bag containing her few possessions, the fluorescent courtroom lights casting harsh shadows across her weathered face. Your Honor, please. Margaret's voice barely rose above a whisper. I just needed somewhere warm to sleep. The shelter was full, and it was so cold. Silence. Judge Thornfield's roar echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Do you think I care about your comfort? You're a vagrant, a public nuisance. You broke into private property. The packed courtroom fell deadly silent. Margaret's great-granddaughter Emma, sitting in the gallery, bit her lip to keep from crying out. The public defender beside Margaret shifted uncomfortably, his cheap suit wrinkled from too many cases like this one. 30 days in county jail, Thornfield declared with savage satisfaction. Maybe that'll teach you to respect other people's property. But just as his gavel began its descent toward the final blow, the heavy courtroom doors burst open with a resounding crash that made everyone turn. The sound of expensive heels clicked against marble as a figure in an immaculate navy suit strode purposefully down the aisle, her presence commanding immediate attention from every person in the room. Margaret Chen had never imagined her life would lead to this moment. Born in San Francisco's Chinatown to immigrant parents who sacrificed everything for their children's education, she had spent 43 years as a dedicated elementary school teacher, touching thousands of young lives with her patience and wisdom. Her modest teacher's salary had never made her wealthy, but it provided stability for her family and allowed her to care for her aging parents. The modest two-bedroom house in the Richmond district had been her sanctuary for decades. There she had raised her daughter Linda after her husband died in a construction accident, helped with homework at the kitchen table, and later welcomed her granddaughter Sarah when Linda struggled with addiction. The house held memories of birthday parties, holiday dinners, and quiet evenings, reading stories to children who saw her as their anchor in an uncertain world. Margaret's life had been built on service and sacrifice. Even in retirement, she volunteered at the local community center, teaching English to new immigrants and helping seniors navigate government services. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who always had soup ready for anyone feeling unwell, who shoveled snow from elderly neighbors' walkways, and who never missed a school board meeting when education funding was threatened. But the American healthcare system had other plans for Margaret's golden years. When Sarah died in a car accident, leaving behind 7-year-old Emma, Margaret didn't hesitate to become the child's guardian. The trauma counseling, the special education services, Emma needed the endless medical appointments. Margaret stretched her fixed income to cover everything her great-granddaughter required. The real devastation came when Margaret's own health began failing. Diabetes, arthritis, and a heart condition required expensive medications and frequent doctor visits. Medicare covered some costs, but the gaps were enormous. When Emma developed asthma that required specialized treatment, Margaret faced an impossible choice: her medications or her great-granddaughter's breathing treatments. She chose Emma, always Emma. Margaret rationed her insulin, skipped heart medications, and ignored the warning signs her body sent. When she finally collapsed and was rushed to the emergency room, the medical bills arrived like an avalanche. The house, her sanctuary, her family's foundation, became collateral for mounting debt. The foreclosure notice came on a Tuesday. Margaret remembered the date because Emma had just brought home a perfect spelling test, and they were celebrating with ice cream when the sheriff knocked. Within 60 days, 3 generations of memories were packed into boxes, most of which went to storage they couldn't afford to maintain. The night that changed everything began like so many others in Margaret's new reality. She and Emma had spent the day at the public library where Margaret helped her great-granddaughter with homework while they both stayed warm and safe. As closing time approached, Margaret's chest tightened with familiar anxiety. The shelter had a waiting list, and their spot in the transitional housing program wouldn't open for another month. "Grandma, great, where will we sleep tonight?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old voice carrying the weight of worries no child should bear. Margaret forced a smile, the same reassuring expression she had perfected during decades of calming frightened students. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll find us somewhere safe." They walked through the darkening streets of downtown, Margaret's arthritic joints protesting with each step. The November wind cut through their thin coats and Emma's breathing grew labored. Margaret recognized the signs of an approaching asthma attack and knew they needed shelter immediately. That's when she saw at the Meridian Building, a gleaming office tower, where she had once worked part-time as a night cleaner to supplement her teaching income. The lobby was heated, spacious, and had comfortable seating. Most importantly, Margaret knew the security guard's routine from her cleaning days. He made rounds every 2 hours, leaving long periods when the lobby was empty. "Just for tonight," Margaret whispered to herself as she guided Emma through the revolving door. "Just until Emma's breathing settles." They found a corner behind a large potted plant where they wouldn't be immediately visible from the street. Margaret wrapped her coat around Emma, who fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from struggling to breathe. For a few precious hours, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. Emma was warm, safe, and breathing easily. The security guard found them at 3 a.m. during his round. Margaret woke to a flashlight shining in her eyes and a gruff voice demanding to know what they were doing there. She tried to explain about Emma's asthma, about the cold, about their situation, but the guard was already calling the police. "I'm sorry," Margaret kept repeating as the officers arrived. "We weren't hurting anything. We just needed somewhere warm." The arrest was gentle but firm. Emma cried as they separated her from Margaret, the child going to emergency foster care, while Margaret was processed for criminal trespassing. In the holding cell, surrounded by women whose stories echoed her own, Margaret realized she had crossed a line she never thought she would approach. The public defender assigned to her case was young, overworked, and well-meaning, but he made it clear that Judge Thornfield rarely showed mercy in trespassing cases, especially involving repeat offenders. Margaret wasn't a repeat offender, but in Thornfield's courtroom, being homeless was apparently crime enough. Margaret's first appearance before Judge Thornfield was a preview of the humiliation to come. The courtroom was packed with defendants facing similar charges, a reflection of the city's growing homelessness crisis that the legal system seemed determined to criminalize rather than address. Margaret watched as Thornfield dispensed harsh sentences with mechanical efficiency, showing no interest in the circumstances that brought people before his bench. When her case was called, Margaret stood on unsteady legs, her public defender beside her, shuffling through papers he'd barely had time to review. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman in her 30s, rattled off the charges with practiced indifference. Criminal trespassing, violation of posted notices, disturbing the peace. "How do you plead?" Thornfield asked without looking up from his paperwork. "Your Honor." Margaret's attorney began. "My client is a retired teacher with no prior criminal record. She was seeking shelter for herself and her great-granddaughter during a medical emergency." "I didn't ask for a biography," Thornfield snapped. "Guilty or not guilty?" Margaret found her voice. "Not guilty, Your Honor. But I'd like to explain." "Save it for trial," Thornfield interrupted. "Next case." The weeks leading up to trial were a nightmare of bureaucratic obstacles and systemic indifference. Margaret was released on her own recognizance, but faced the impossible task of finding stable housing while navigating the legal system. Emma remained in foster care, and Margaret was allowed only supervised visits twice a week. During one visit, Emma asked the question that broke Margaret's heart. "Grandma Great, did I do something wrong? Is that why we can't live together?" Margaret's attorney, David Park, was fresh out of law school and overwhelmed by his caseload, but he genuinely cared about his clients. He spent hours researching precedents and trying to build a defense, but the legal system offered few protections for people in Margaret's situation. "The problem isn't your case specifically," David explained during one of their meetings in the cramped public defender's office. "It's that Judge Thornfield sees homelessness as a moral failing rather than a systemic issue. He's been on the bench for 15 years, and he's never met a trespassing case he wouldn't prosecute to the fullest extent." David discovered that Thornfield had a reputation among the city's legal community for his harsh treatment of homeless defendants. Defense attorneys called him Maximum Marcus behind his back, and several had filed complaints about his conduct that were routinely dismissed by the Judicial Review Board. Meanwhile, Margaret struggled to survive on the streets while preparing for trial. She learned the unspoken rules of homelessness, which doorways were safe for a few hours' rest, which restaurants threw away edible food, which public restrooms stayed unlocked after hours. Every day was a battle for basic dignity and survival. The local homeless services were overwhelmed and underfunded. Margaret's name went on waiting lists for everything from shelter beds to transitional housing, but the need far exceeded available resources. Social workers, though well-intentioned, could offer little more than referrals to other overloaded programs. As the trial date approached, Margaret's health deteriorated. Without regular access to her medications and proper nutrition, her diabetes became harder to manage. Her arthritis flared in the cold weather, making it difficult to walk. Most heartbreaking of all, her separation from Emma was taking a toll on both of them. The morning of the trial, Margaret sat in the courthouse bathroom, trying to make herself presentable with soap and paper towels. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman she barely recognized. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that hung loose on her shrinking frame. She had lost 30 pounds since her arrest, and her hands shook from medication withdrawal. David Park found her there, his young face etched with worry. "Mrs. Chen, I have to be honest with you. Judge Thornfield denied our motion to dismiss, and he's refused to allow testimony about your background or circumstances. He's treating this as a simple trespassing case." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer from the fear in his eyes. "It means we're looking at jail time. Probably 60 to 90 days given his track record." Margaret closed her eyes, thinking of Emma in foster care, waiting for her to come home. The little girl had already lost so much. Her mother, her home, her stability. Now she was about to lose the only family she had left. "There's something else," David continued reluctantly. "The prosecutor is arguing that your case should be used as an example to deter others. They want to send a message about property rights and public safety." In the courtroom, Margaret took her seat at the defendant's table and looked around at the faces in the gallery. A few social workers she recognized from the shelter, some other homeless individuals who had come to show support, and in the back corner, a well-dressed woman Margaret didn't recognize taking notes on a legal pad. Judge Thornfield entered with his usual theatrical flair, his black robes billowing as he took his place behind the bench. The bailiff called the court to order, and Margaret's trial began with the prosecutor painting her as a threat to public safety and property rights. "Your Honor, the defendant's actions represent a growing problem in our city," the prosecutor argued. "If we don't enforce these laws consistently, we're essentially inviting people to treat private property as their personal shelter. The Meridian Buildings owners have a right to secure premises, and the defendant violated that right." David did his best with the limited defense Thornfield would allow, but it was clear the judge had already made up his mind. When Margaret took the stand to testify on her own behalf, Thornfield's hostility was palpable. "So you admit you entered the building without permission?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor, but—" "And you admit you remained there despite posted signs prohibiting trespassing?" "Yes, but my great-granddaughter needed—" "Just answer the questions, Mrs. Chen. I'm not interested in your excuses." The moment that changed everything came when Margaret, desperate to make him understand, broke down completely. "Your Honor, please. I'm not a criminal. I taught children for 43 years. I've never hurt anyone. I just needed somewhere safe for my little girl to breathe." Thornfield's response was cruel, even by his standards. "Spare me the theatrics, Mrs. Chen. If you cared about that child, you wouldn't have put her in this situation in the first place." The courtroom gasped at his callousness, but it was the well-dressed woman in the back who stood up, her face flushed with anger. "Your Honor, with respect, that's enough." The woman who had stood up was Victoria Sterling, senior partner at Sterling & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious law firms. She had been in the courtroom researching a pro bono project on homelessness and judicial bias when she witnessed Thornfield's treatment of Margaret. What she saw violated every principle of justice she had spent 30 years defending. "Your Honor," Victoria said, stepping forward despite the bailiff's attempts to maintain order, "I'm Victoria Sterling, and I'm requesting permission to address the court as amicus curiae." Thornfield's face reddened. "Miss Sterling, you have no standing in this case. Sit down or I'll hold you in contempt." "Then hold me in contempt," Victoria replied calmly, "because I'm not sitting down while you abuse your judicial authority." The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. Margaret looked up through her tears, confused by this unexpected intervention. David Park sat frozen, unsure whether this development would help or hurt his client. Victoria continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. Your Honor, I've been observing your courtroom for the past week as part of a judicial review study. What I've witnessed is a systematic pattern of bias against homeless defendants that violates both the spirit and letter of the law. That's enough, Thornfield shouted, pounding his gavel. Bailiff, remove this woman from my courtroom. But Victoria was already pulling out her phone, live streaming the proceedings to her firm's social media accounts. Judge Thornfield, you're being recorded. Every word you've spoken to Mrs. Chen, every dismissive gesture, every violation of her constitutional rights is now part of the public record. The bailiff hesitated, looking between the judge and Victoria. In that moment of uncertainty, Victoria pressed her advantage. Mrs. Chen, she said, turning to Margaret, you don't have to accept this treatment. You have rights, and this court has an obligation to respect them. Over the next hour, Victoria systematically dismantled the prosecution's case and exposed the flaws in Thornfield's handling of the trial. She cited precedent after precedent, referenced constitutional protections, and challenged every assumption the court had made about Margaret's character and circumstances. Your Honor, Mrs. Chen is not a career criminal. She's a retired educator who dedicated her life to public service. She's a guardian caring for a child with special needs. She's a victim of a healthcare system that bankrupts families and a housing market that prices out working people. She's everything we should be protecting, not prosecuting. Thornfield tried to regain control, but Victoria's intervention had fundamentally shifted the dynamics in the courtroom. The media attention her live stream generated brought reporters rushing to the courthouse. Within hours, Margaret's story was trending on social media, and legal experts were weighing in on Thornfield's conduct. The judge called a recess, during which Victoria formally entered her appearance as Margaret's counsel, replacing the overwhelmed public defender. She brought with her a team of associates and paralegals who immediately began preparing a comprehensive defense. Mrs. Chen, Victoria said during the break, I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win. Margaret, still in shock from the morning's events, could barely speak. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Because justice isn't about knowing someone personally, Victoria replied. It's about recognizing their humanity and defending their rights when the system fails them. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had completely changed. Victoria had used the recess to file multiple motions challenging the prosecution's case and Thornfield's conduct. She had also contacted the State Judicial Ethics Board and the local bar association, formally documenting the judge's behavior. Thornfield, now aware that his actions were under scrutiny, attempted to moderate his tone, but the damage was already done. Victoria methodically presented evidence of Margaret's character and circumstances, calling witnesses who testified to her decades of service as an educator and community volunteer. Emma's foster mother testified about the little girl's distress at being separated from Margaret, describing how the child cried every night for her grandma great. A former principal spoke about Margaret's dedication to her students, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Medical experts explained the health consequences of homelessness and the challenges of managing chronic conditions without stable housing. Your Honor, Victoria argued, the prosecution wants you to see Mrs. Chen as a trespasser, a lawbreaker, a threat to public order. But the evidence shows she's a pillar of her community who found herself in an impossible situation through no fault of her own. Victoria also presented evidence of the systemic issues that had led to Margaret's homelessness. The gap between Social Security benefits and housing costs, the inadequacy of Medicare coverage for chronic conditions, the shortage of affordable housing for seniors. She painted a picture of a society that had failed one of its most vulnerable members. The prosecution, caught off guard by Victoria's intervention, struggled to maintain their narrative. The young prosecutor, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the case had taken, made a half-hearted attempt to argue that the law was the law regardless of circumstances. But Victoria was relentless. She presented documentation of Thornfield's pattern of harsh sentences for homeless defendants, comparing his treatment of Margaret to his handling of similar cases involving defendants from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. The disparities were stark and undeniable. Your Honor, Victoria said, her voice rising with passion, Mrs. Chen committed no crime except the crime of being poor in America. She sought shelter not for comfort or convenience, but out of desperation to protect a child's health. If that's criminal, then we've criminalized basic human survival. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of reporters typing and cameras clicking. Margaret sat at the defense table, tears streaming down her face, not from shame, but from gratitude that someone was finally speaking for her with such eloquence and conviction. Thornfield, visibly shaken by the exposure of his biases and the public attention the case had generated, made one final attempt to assert his authority. Ms. Sterling, while your advocacy is passionate, it doesn't change the fact that your client violated the law. The building owners have rights, and those rights were violated. Victoria was ready for this argument. Your Honor, the building owners have already indicated they don't wish to pursue this case. They've been contacted by the media and have expressed sympathy for Mrs. Chen's situation. They're more interested in finding solutions than seeking punishment. The final moment came when Victoria called her last witness, Emma Chen, Margaret's 8-year-old great-granddaughter. Despite objections from the prosecution about the appropriateness of having a child testify, Thornfield allowed it, perhaps sensing that denying the request would only generate more negative publicity. Emma, small and fragile but remarkably composed, took the witness stand with the help of a court-appointed advocate. Victoria's questioning was gentle but powerful. Emma, can you tell the court about your grandma great? She takes care of me, Emma said in a clear, small voice. When I can't breathe, she helps me. She reads me stories and helps with my homework. She makes me feel safe. Were you scared the night you went to the building? Yes, I couldn't breathe good, and it was really cold. But Grandma Great found us a warm place, and then I could breathe better. Do you miss living with your Grandma Great? Emma's composure finally broke. I want to go home with her. I don't understand why we can't be together. Did I do something bad? The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of Emma's quiet sobs and Margaret's whispered reassurances from the defense table. Even Thornfield seemed affected by the child's testimony, his stern expression softening for the first time during the trial. Victoria made her final argument with Emma, still on the witness stand, the visual impact of the separated family impossible to ignore. Your Honor, this is what we're really talking about here. Not property rights or legal precedents, but a family torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Mrs. Chen didn't choose homelessness. She didn't choose to trespass. She chose to protect this child, and that choice led her to seek shelter in the only place she could find. If we criminalize that choice, we criminalize love itself. Judge Thornfield sat silent for several long minutes, the weight of the courtroom's attention and his own conscience bearing down on him. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, more thoughtful. Mrs. Chen, please stand. Margaret rose on unsteady legs, Victoria beside her, both women prepared for any outcome. Mrs. Chen, I owe you an apology. My conduct in this courtroom has been inappropriate. I allowed my frustration with the broader issues of homelessness to cloud my judgment about your individual case and circumstances. The judge paused, looking directly at Margaret for the first time with something approaching respect. The charges against you are dismissed. Furthermore, I'm ordering the immediate reunification of your family. Emma should be with her grandmother where she belongs. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Margaret collapsed into Victoria's arms, sobbing with relief and gratitude. Emma ran from the witness stand to embrace her great-grandmother, their reunion watched by everyone in the packed courtroom. But Victoria wasn't finished. Over the following weeks, she worked with Margaret to file a federal civil rights lawsuit challenging the city's criminalization of homelessness. The case garnered national attention and led to significant policy changes, including the establishment of specialized homeless courts focused on connecting people with services rather than punishment. Margaret and Emma were housed in transitional housing, while Victoria's firm worked pro bono to help them navigate the complex systems of social services and benefits. Within 6 months, they had secured permanent, affordable housing and the stability they had lost. Judge Thornfield, chastened by the experience and the subsequent ethics investigation, began working with local homeless advocacy groups to reform his court's approach to cases involving housing insecurity. He never fully redeemed himself in the eyes of many, but he did begin the work of acknowledging and addressing his biases. Margaret returned to what she did best, teaching and caring for others. She began volunteering with Victoria's firm's pro bono program, helping other homeless individuals navigate the legal system with dignity and hope. Her story became a rallying cry for criminal justice reform and a reminder that behind every case file is a human being deserving of compassion and respect. The little girl who had asked if she had done something wrong was finally home breathing easily in the safety of her great-grandmother's love, in a system that had learned, however slowly, to see her family's humanity.